field studies and talks about the relationship between especially news media coverage and our perceptions about diversity. So we start, for instance, with Boyle's paper. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to use Chris. I'm going to use people's last names because I'm terrible with that. But I mean, I'm old enough to remember when the bulk of the research about perceptions of minorities in the media were primarily content analyses. Lots of content analyses of, well, let's look at television, let's look at television news, let's look at print news, let's look at magazines, let's look at photographs. And of course, that has to be like one of our early steps, right? We have to know, we have to be able to show that the content that we are concerned about exists. And so Chris Boyle's paper does a very nice job of using this very interesting tool. I had not heard about this, linguistic tool where you can scrape the data out of these text files from what was 1,300 some articles, and you can use that to get a better sense of, well, what are the words that are being used to help describe this situation, the coverage of Ferguson. And so the paper does a great job of comparing what is one of our most important newspapers, right, the New York Times, versus how are the local journalists covering this. And so it's good to kind of start with this very focused content analysis of this is what the situation was in the press. And as we know, maybe not enough of our fellow citizens get their news from newspapers as opposed to now watching television or just getting it off of Twitter or, God knows, Breitbart. But so we have a nice sort of baseline of this is what we had. And it's pretty clear that what we had was very much the protest paradigm, right? Which the protest paradigm, which Kilgo and Morale, how that your paper, I mean, you talked a little bit about, and it's, again, when you've been around for a while, it's always kind of nice to see people who you, like, were friends with 25 years ago still getting cited. So like Doug McLeod and Jim Hertog, and that, just the development of that idea, the protest paradigm. Well, here it is, right? Here it is in coverage of the protests in Ferguson. But then what Kilgo and Rao are doing then is also sort of problematizing the way in which we think of the relationship between media and our attitudes, and reminding us that, well, okay, because we have these pre-existing attitudes, right? These pre-existing attitudes before some researcher comes along and says, I'm going to start measuring these attitudes right about here, and then we're going to look at some press coverage. And it's a good reminder that, these pre-existing attitudes actually are really important because they kind of set a baseline against which we think about how are we going to think more or less, are we going to think better or worse about something. So that's good. I also want to come back to that paper in a second too. The last paper that we heard from, the Mislan and Sheben, also looks, in its own way, brings up again the protest paradigm, but to say that that is the mainstream way of talking about protests. But for these groups and for these alternative media sites and for the groups that organize this around this sort of larger perspective, that's a counter narrative. It's not a popular counter narrative in the sense that, notice, it never there was nothing about Palestine showing up in your data about how the New York Times or the St. Louis Post-Dispatch did this. So within some larger mainstream sort of way of discourse about talking about this, we always have to be cognizant of the existence of these counter narratives, and now the new ways in which those counter narratives can actually reach geographically disparate peoples to connect them and discuss. Now, that may not be strong enough to break into the mainstream media, and therefore not really be able to sort of touch on those broader sort of pre-existing ways in which we look at protest, because it's a relatively small group of people who are talking. But it is important that at least now they have more ways in which to communicate and presumably maybe actually break into the larger mainstream, not that it happens. And so then we come to Lanier, Holt, and Schweitzer. I'm sorry, I'm going to use my German accent for that, Schweitzer.
Good enough.
And so here we're taking social identity theory, incredibly well-loved, very well-supported way of thinking about identity and its relationship to how we understand people. And the whole paper is pointing out, well, this is actually fairly complicated, because it's not just my one identity trumps everything else. And other research from social psychology points out that, you know, we can think of identity as being kind of on a scale, where for some folks we really strongly identify with one particular group, and for other people, well, you know, yeah, I'm kind of part of that group, but maybe not. And so the whole paper is also problematizing the degree to which we just go to that deceptively simple explanation of, well, it's just about race, or it's just about the group. And I think what all four of these papers together remind us is that actually how salient a particular part of our identities are matters a lot in how we're going to interpret what's being covered in the press about something like Michael Brown's murder and the subsequent protests, and how we're going to interpret that, how we're going to be attracted to that, where we're going to find that kind of press coverage, and so, and whether it's salient now or in the larger context. And we're doing that against these pre-existing attitudes that sit out there, and that, generally speaking, those pre-existing attitudes largely support the status quo, right? There's a theory out of psychology called, oh my God, I'm blanking on it. Okay, that's probably not a good thing. But there's a
social justification theory, or
yeah, something along those lines, yes. But the idea that our sort of inherent baseline attitude is we want to believe that for the most part, the system is somewhat fair and kind of works. And so I think that leads to a protest paradigm, because protesters are challenging the status quo, and we don't like that. And our pre-existing attitude is discomfort with that. That journalists trained in a certain way to cover the press, or excuse me, to cover events in certain ways, are going to navigate toward that kind of protest paradigm more often. And then, although you can have these alternative voices trying against the tide of getting us to think about, well, you know, Ferguson is not that much different than what's happening in Palestine, or, you know, we need to talk about the militarism of the police, or how we construct the other as a threat. They can try to get those messages out there, and I like your point that, you know, social media are not the same as alternative media, which is very much in the news these days, as Facebook and Twitter and YouTube have to decide, you know, where do they draw the line, what do they do, what don't they do, to what extent is it a business decision rather than an ethical one. Not that those two are always mutually exclusive, but sometimes they are. And so I think that this collection of papers does a really good job of highlighting the complexity of what it is we're trying to do. Because we're trying to see, do the media actually impact how we think about our fellow citizens, our fellow human beings? And the simplest explanation, as attractive as it is, doesn't really seem to cut it, because we're so much more complex. And I think it's because at the heart of it, how we see ourselves, the parts of who we are that matter to us, not only differ between us all, white male, white straight male, African American males and women and people of color, and you know, those identities are important to us, but also in different ways at different times. And to what extent can media make those identities salient? Can they frame them in ways that problematize them and support the status quo, or can they challenge those traditional ways of framing the other? That's a complex task we've set out for ourselves. And so this collection of 4 papers, I think, nicely fits together to highlight that complexity, but at the same time giving us a little bit of a roadmap about how to proceed. So I think that's probably where I will stop. And I think now we should finish off the conference with some questions.